Despite international condemnation and sanctions, North Korea continues to push ahead with its plans to become a recognized nuclear weapon state. At this critical juncture, with Northeast Asia poised between the global push for non-proliferation and a potential nuclear breakout, this panel will examine the likely thresholds and hurdles that face each of the region's powers.
Okay, good afternoon. My name's Toby Dalton. I'm at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, and I would imagine that this will be a hot topic, nuclear Northeast Asia. I think probably it would be easy to spend the entire time talking about North Korea, and certainly we will spend some time talking about North Korea. But hopefully we'll also be able to broaden the aperture a little bit and spend some time talking about what the implications for the region are, this question about dominoes, whether other states in the region, because of North Korean behavior, might also consider some nuclear steps of their own, or whether there are other alternative pathways, whether conflict is one of those paths, or whether there's some sort of negotiation that's possible. And then what some of the thresholds for some of these alternative pathways might be. And given that we're also supposed to have some sort of positive element, maybe we can also talk a little bit about what some of the pragmatic and realistic options for policymakers are. Given that we've been now dealing with this issue for almost 20 years in its sort of current form, and have seen this movie several times, not this movie, but this idea several times before, that there's these moments of crisis and then some negotiations and things work for a little while and then they break down again. We've got three very good panelists to help us unravel these things. Richard Weitz, down at the far end, is a senior fellow and director of the Center for Political and Military Analysis at the Hudson Institute in Washington. Next to him is Bruce Klingner, who's a senior research fellow in Northeast Asia at the Heritage Foundation. And finally, Bong-Geun, who's now with the, I can never get the name right because it used to be IFANS, but now it's the Korea National Diplomatic Academy, where he's a professor and the Director General of the Department of National Security and Unification Studies. So rather than starting out with the sort of 5-minute set of remarks, what I thought I would do is try to tee up this issue and work through the discussion in a more sort of directed way. And what I thought I would do first is ask Richard if he would talk a little bit about this particular moment. In your talking points that you wrote for this session, you suggested that this particular crisis is a little bit more dangerous than what we've seen in the past, and I wanted to start by drawing you out a little bit on that point.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to thank everybody for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to participating in a really exciting panel. We've got a great group of people here. The reason, of course, when we were hearing the North Korean threats, a lot of us have said, well, we've seen this movie before. We're used to hearing outrageous statements coming from Pyongyang. We've also seen nuclear tests and missile launches before. And so there was some complacency in some places. But I wanted to caution that there are some differences from what we've seen in the past, and that's something we need to be attuned for, and shouldn't necessarily take for granted that everything will be fine, the crisis will end as other ones have. The first is that North Korea now clearly has the capacity to detonate a nuclear explosive device. They've tested their weapon at least 3 times. And whereas initially there was some thought that perhaps it wasn't a completely successful test because some of the yields were so low, there seems to have been a decision in Pyongyang that unlike previous nuclear weapon states, they didn't actually need to go through the pattern of testing a large device to see if their model works and then try and miniaturize it so they could actually launch it on a warhead. It's entirely plausible that the design has been proven enough by other countries. They decided to skip that and just go ahead straight to try and find a weapon that they could place upon a warhead, which would naturally be miniaturized. So that might explain the low yields. Second, North Korea clearly has a long-range missile capacity. Most people don't think that they have sufficient sophistication to place a warhead on a long-range missile that could reach North America, at least at present. But if they don't have that now, they soon will be, if they continue to have the opportunity to test the warheads and devices. Clearly, they have the capacity to launch a nuclear warhead against South Korea, against Japan, against the US forces based there. And this is a major challenge for all of us. Second, the Republic of Korea has, of course, adopted, at least in declarative policy, and I believe in actual practice, a much sterner stand towards northern provocations. Whereas in 2010, South Korea would take its time to understand what had happened to what was thinking of its warship and try to mobilize forces in the UN Security Council. And the same with the shelling of its border village. There's a decision to pursue initially diplomatic efforts through the council, try and work with the Chinese to put more pressure on Pyongyang. Now the decision has been made that South Korea will respond in some way to a North Korean attack, at least in terms of equivalent damage, if not necessarily total symmetry. So if there's a shelling of a border village, I wouldn't expect South Korean forces to shell a northern village in return. They might strike back in some other way. And one way that was given me as examples, for example, launch a long-range cruise missile that would destroy the statues of all the Kim family members that happen to be in Pyongyang, or some other means to really show that they mean business. But this is something, of course, we haven't seen before, and it's not clear whether even an equivalent response or less than equivalent response would then be received with a sense in Pyongyang, well, this is just a tit for tat, now we're even. We could actually see North Korea plausibly strike first. And of course, the unfortunate thing about the intra-Korean boundaries, the countries are so physically proximate that there are some incentives to try and get in the first strike if there is going to be a major war. The United States also has been showing off some of its new capabilities in the region. For the first time, we've seen F-22 stealth fighters and B-2 strategic bombers active in recent exercises. The Obama administration decided to unleash the U.S. Treasury as well to seek more, to inflict damage in an area which really appears to annoy the North Koreans, which is tie down some of their financial flows and crack down on their illicit gains. Third, the connection between North Korea and Iran is much more visible and much more evident in several dimensions. There's considerable evidence that the two countries are cooperating, at least in the sense of exchanging insights in missile technologies. They have a formal cooperation agreement on technology. There's evidence that North Korea have been present in Iranian rocket launches and vice versa. That would explain, in a way, some of the quite remarkable progress North Korea made between its failed April long-range ballistic launch and the successful December launch. Of more concern is the potential for cooperation in the area of nuclear enrichment, warhead design, a more direct application of nuclear technologies to military purposes. We have no evidence that this has taken place, at least in the open sources, but it's certainly something that would be plausible and would allow the Iranians to develop a nuclear weapons capacity even in the absence of the kind of clear testing or other incidents which have been cited as a possible red line for military intervention. More generally, policymakers in Washington and elsewhere are wondering, how does the response of the United States towards North Korea's provocations, how would that going to affect the dynamics of negotiations with Iran? And it is not inconceivable that one reason that explains why the Iranian negotiating stance hardened between the two Almaty meetings is that North Korea got away with with detonating a third nuclear device and making a series of threats in the interim, enough that might have persuaded the Iranians that the U.S. red lines are something that they can, if not necessarily cross, can at least play around with. And finally, we have this issue of all the new leaders that have emerged in the Asia-Pacific region in recent years. the new government in China. We've certainly heard much more interesting statements coming from Chinese leaders. They're making it clear, at least in various ways, that there's a lot of dissatisfaction in China about having a North Korean behavior, and certainly I don't feel very envious to the Chinese having to have North Korea as a neighbor, since its disturbing behavior is going to rebound negatively in Chinese security. But we haven't really seen a major change in Chinese foreign policy regarding North Korea or in other avenues with respect to that. There's the change in leadership in the Republic of Korea. It's not clear to me yet what the new South Korean leadership, how that might differ from the old. There's some continuities in terms of personnel, but certainly something that we have to think about whether we would receive the same kind of response we have with the past administration, with the current one in terms of U.S. South Korean dynamics. And the new leadership in Japan is clearly more a sort of in many dimensions. Now, what's going to be interesting, of course, is whether we'll see something come out of the Japan-Russia relationship. That's something that having a strong leader in Tokyo is a prerequisite to deliver the kind of compromises we want to see in that territorial dispute. But at least in terms of South Korea, the Japanese government North Korea has taken a very firm stand against North Korean provocations, and we could expect that to continue. And of course, in Pyongyang, we've all been very disappointed. There was a lot of hope that with the transition, the emergence of a new, younger leadership in North Korea, we would really see perhaps some opportunities for change. That was clearly China's hope. The U.S., I think, made an effort through the LEAP deal engagement to offer the North Koreans a path towards rapprochement with the United States if they chose to accept it. But for whatever reason, that deal quickly fell apart when North Korea decided to go ahead and launch its long-range ballistic missile. And then we've seen an unprecedented series of statements and provocations and some really creative use of how to cause trouble, such as telling the embassies in South Korea that you better take your personnel out, it's going to become a war zone, or now what we're seeing with Kaesong. And all of this is not very encouraging for those of us who are concerned with this issue.
So let's pick up there. I want to come back to the regional piece, but first I want to drill down a little bit more on trying to understand what North Korea is about here. And Bruce, you've studied North Korea and followed these issues for quite some time. What do you think the motivations are? What's driving this behavior? And maybe you could sort of walk through some of the progression of events that you've seen as contributing to this crisis that Richard has described.
Sure. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here, and I was really thinking that as I was flying in yesterday, that despite 2 months of very severe North Korean threats, that there was still a Korean peninsula to fly into, which had really been in doubt for a little bit. Also, I remember last year at the Asan Plenum that the day before, North Korea had made very specific threats to blow up several conservative South Korean media organizations. So I'm not really sure what Asan and North Korea will have planned for next year's plenum, just to generate, if not interest, concern amongst the participants. I think if we look at why North Korea is doing things, I think sort of break it into 3 parts. One is, let's review a little bit what North Korea has done. The second part often gets into a foreign versus domestic objective debate. And then the third part is, do the reasons matter? On the first part, a lot of times people tend to dismiss it as, oh, what are those silly or crazy little North Koreans up to? And it's very dismissive. We've seen it before. It's circular history. But let's sort of review what they've done in the last couple of years. It's repeatedly violated UN Security Council resolutions. They've violated the armistice. They've violated numerous agreements that they made to first never pursue nuclear weapons and then to give up what they promised never to pursue in the first place. They conducted 2 acts of war against the Republic of Korea in 2010. They've threatened everybody and his brother with specific, not only strategic level nuclear annihilation, but tactical level attacks. They've made very clear that they have no intention of ever giving up their nuclear weapons, whether they ever had that intention in the first place. And also, they've rebuffed numerous sincere efforts by the United States and South Korea to engage in dialogue and negotiations. So I don't think we can just be dismissive of North Korean actions. Now, why do they do it? As I said, a lot of it is a debate between foreign and domestic. And the foreign reasons would be it makes them relevant. If they didn't have a strong military, if they didn't have nuclear weapons and a means to deliver them, we could largely ignore them. It's the fact that they are threatening and they have a capability to fulfill those threats that makes them relevant and makes us have to pay attention to them. And because of those capabilities and the intentions and the threats, they feel it gives them greater leverage, it gives them negotiating leverage, it induces benefits from the U.S. and its allies, in large part to buy our way to the previous status quo, to lower the tensions that North Korea themselves raised. The domestic factors tend to be it's a way of keeping Kim Jong-un and before him Kim Jong-il in power. And oftentimes, whether it's by design or just by argument, the domestic factors tend to be used as an excuse to excuse away North Korean behavior. And what I remember in 1994 when State Department's Intelligence Bureau predicted that Kim Jong-il was going to be a bold economic reformer and North Korea was on the cusp of bold economic reform. Well, that didn't work out. So then the next theory was factionalism, the hardliners and the softliners. And it was usually depicted as Kim Jong-il didn't want to do the bad things he was doing. It was only he was being forced into it by the hardliners. He had to do these threatening acts because otherwise there'd be a coup by the hardliners. And we're seeing in some cases that same analysis carried forward into Kim Jong-un. The reality is we knew that Kim Jong-il was directing the show, that he was telling the military what to do, not the other way around. And so when people tend to depict it as hardliners and softliners, it's a way of trying to excuse away Kim Jong-un's behavior. There's no evidence that this is not the policy that he wants himself. So I think if we overplay the domestic factors, it's a way of trying to overlook their behavior. Now, do the reasons matter? The reality is we don't know why they're doing it. It's probably a combination of both domestic and foreign factors. But I think what really the countries need to do is focus on the behavior rather than the possible reasons for the behavior, and you have to create your policies accordingly. We know that a person robbed a bank. We may not know why he robbed the bank. Did he, was he trying to get money? Was he trying to impress someone? Did he not get enough hugs as a child? But the reality is they did the act. And so I think with North Korea, we have to pursue it, have the same kind of ideas. They did the acts repeatedly, and that reveals the nature of the regime, the likelihood of their policy in the future. And the U.S. and South Korea and others have to plan their policy accordingly as to what they have done in the past and what they're likely to do in the future.
So, Bong-Geun, I want to turn next to you. And before the Boston bombing pushed this out of the news, at least in the United States, we were treated to about 2 straight weeks of rather breathless reporting about all of the concerns about North Korean behavior. And there was this sense of crisis, which Bruce alluded to, about whether there'd be a Korean peninsula to fly into or not. I kind of want your sense about how this is viewed here. Is this really a new threat or sort of a new, more serious aspect of crisis, as Richard has suggested? And what do you see as the most important parts of that?
Let me begin with thanking to Asan for having me and having the opportunity to discuss and revisit these North Korean nuclear issues. As I've been, just like any other researchers and experts following these issues for a couple of decades, we are a little bit fed up and somewhat often lost what to say. But this time, this third nuclear test was something, something new to us. And before that, it was more like they were testing nuclear explosive devices. And we didn't know how, when they will be real threat to us. But nowadays, we all recognize that they are very close to weaponization. If not now, maybe tomorrow. And also with this delivery system, those threats are more real. So we have to think really hard, and it is not time to waste our, this time to, so let me just say a couple words about how do we see it and how do we, face this issue again. First, here's a couple of my own observations about these North Korean nuclear issues. In fact, two of these. One is that in the past, we made an error of somewhat underestimating North Korean desire to acquire weapons and their capability to have nuclear weapons. That has been, if we knew maybe 10, 20 years ago, we might have had a more hard diplomacy to denuclearize. But at the time, we had a somewhat easy opinion. But nowadays, to the contrary, on the opposite side, we are somewhat overestimating North Korean nuclear will and the capability, and somewhat just giving up, the goal of denuclearize. So I would like to, we should not give in to this pessimism. We have to deal with it. We have to face it. This is really important to us, and we can't live with nuclear North Korea. And secondly, here's another my observation. Now is always better than later. During the last 20 years, North Korea was increasing its nuclear capacity, and always they are coming up with a much higher price tag. So, at the moment, it's not easy to deal with it. But however, if we postpone it, we may have to pay maybe higher price tag. So always, I ask my government always, we better just tackle it now than later. But it's somehow, it was not easy to do so. Then, how to do it? How to denuclearize North Korea? And often when I say something, people say, we have tried everything. We have exhausted all options, probably. But still, I don't think so. First of all, we need a Korea-specific denuclearization formula, or what I say, Korea-specific denuclearization solution. Previously, we had a very successful denuclearization case in Argentina and Brazil. So we applied that into Korean Peninsula, and that becomes into Korean denuclearization declaration. When we have a 1994 Ukraine case, they applied into Korean Peninsula. They became 1994 US DPRK, agreed framework. And also there was a Libyan case, always it was popular to say, why don't we have a Libyan case in Korean Peninsula? But when I see that all those cases were somewhat easier case than North Korea, in those cases, there were end of Cold War, there were the regime changes. So all these governments in those other cases, they are ready to go forward for denuclearization. They are only negotiating terms of it. But North Korea was not like that. So we are facing much more difficult cases than any other denuclearization case in other words. So we should be ready to face it with a very high price tag often, or with a very strong hardline diplomacy. That's probably the first things that we need to look at. Secondly, we need a sustainable North Korea policy. We have a change of government every 4 and 5 years. And even within one term or within one country, Korea suffers from South-South conflict. Someone wants to go to, sunshine policy, the other one to go to the other policy. Even in the United States, often, because of this, divided policy between the administration and your Congress, you have often, just inactive policy or no policy. Korea was also, we had that. Often they just come up with just very nice words of, constructive patience, whatever. But still, I think, we need a sustainable policy. When I say a sustainability, it should have a consensus. Korea, you need to have a domestic consensus. And the United States should be supporting it. And also, it should be supported by other countries too. And also, it should be accepted by North Korea. That's a problem. If they don't accept it, they might be forced to accept it, but they change their minds in a year or two. So the whole deal is gone. So it's not an easy job, but however, I think we need to work to make a sustainable policy. And thirdly, we need both a carrot and stick. When I say we need carrot and stick, people are saying, we have tried that. We have used sticks, we have tried carrots. But in my view, those are too soft, and or maybe carrot was too small. I would say just a cotton, stick, or maybe a rice cake in Korean word saying rice cake on the painting. We need the real tangible and the big carrot, and we need the real tangible and the big stick. So that, and also we should use them, apply them simultaneously, so that we can push and pull North Korea instead of just using one at a time. We need a very strong dose of these carrot and stick. And I believe previously we have used the sunshine policy and the regime change policy or strategic patience policy. But I believe if we could apply any one of them for a long period, I think we could come up with some result. But every 4 or 5 years, we have to change that. And even with these policies, they don't have a strong domestic support. So I just urge the government again that we need to, talk within the government and talk among governments. So before we go to talk to North Korea, we better have what is our own hand, what it can offer, and what it can, impose on North Korea. We better have some very, strong understanding among all of us, among countries and among people. And also, we need China in this in our wagon together. In the meantime, China was more like a bystander. Often, from time to time, it tried to be a mediator, but also it was just happy with a bystander. But with North Korea's nuclear program now, we are seeing U.S. military posture in Korean Peninsula is changing. It used to be a tactical military posture against North Korea. But when this North Korean military nuclear threats are becoming more real, I believe that the U.S. military posture is changing from tactical into strategic on the Korean Peninsula. I think that would cover even China. So I believe that China has a high stake. They can't really being idle as a bystander. I think so that we will have China to play a more active role, then we could come up with a much better solution. And finally, what I've said so far was somewhat all the questions and all the answers. But here we have a couple of new questions. We may have to deal with this inconvenient issues. Like, as denuclearization would take some time, we have to raise questions how to deal with the imminent North Korean nuclear safety and nuclear security of North Korean nuclear facilities. They are building nuclear power reactors, LWR, and what is the safety of that? And they have a lot of nuclear material and nuclear technology. How do we prevent them from spreading to all over the world? Those are becoming very serious issues. So we have to deal with the nuclear safety and security of North Korean issues in coming years. And secondly, assuming North Korea's nuclear armament, how are you sure of North Korea's command and control mechanism of nuclear weapons, free from accidental and impermissible uses? Recently, North Korea enacted a new law, named as regarding further solidifying the status as a self-defensible nuclear weapon state. It has about 10 articles, and among them, one of them was that it says that it states that the use of nuclear weapons lies solely on the last order of a DPRK military supreme commander. That means only Kim Jong-un is in control of the final use of nuclear weapons. The problem was that this is just a young leader who don't have any experiences and who could be, wielded by any other environment. And the problem was that I believe this is the only leader in the world who are having nuclear weapons, but they are not responsible to its people. In other countries, presidents are responsible for using nuclear weapons. So they are responsible. Before using that, they may think a second, maybe twice or 3 times. And how am I going to be responsible to my people? But here in North Korea, Kim Jong-un is the sole responsible person, and I don't know how he's responsible to whom. That's going to be a serious problem. So we have to face with this North Korean, control and the command of these weapons, and while we try to denuclearize North Korea. And finally, we may need a new category to call North Korea as a nuclear weapon state. I don't like to use it as a nuclear weapon state, and it can be called as a nuclear weapon state because only NPT says that the weapons state before having nuclear weapons before 1967 are nuclear weapon state. But the problem was in probably 5-10 years, it could become one of a de facto nuclear state. But still, I believe they are different from de facto nuclear state. North Korea have cheated and withdraw from the NPT, and they proliferate and wield the nuclear threat at will. They are different from others. So I may raise that, why don't we call it a least nuclear arming state or something like that? And we need a new category. That's what I'm going to propose.
Maybe we can come back to that in a little bit later. So, Richard, I wanted to come back to you now, and you had said that the Leap Day deal wasn't necessarily such a bad deal, it's just that it kind of unraveled very quickly, and perhaps for a variety of reasons. On the other hand, Bong-Geun has suggested that any of the strategies that have been tried for a while, might have been successful had we actually stuck with them. Just sort of your sense about where Washington is at these days on policy options, and whether there's any appetite for Leap Day deal 2. I guess we're already past February, but what's the outlook?
I think that James Steinberg, who just spoke, represented the view in Washington is that nothing we do seems to work. So, we try and engage with Pyongyang, that encourage them to be more assertive. We threaten them, and then they just lie low for a while and then come back. We offer them, we try and sanction them, but they can just displace the effects of the sanctions on their people. And so the general sense is we don't have a good policy option in the case of North Korea. The hope until recently was we could just wait out the transition in leadership, and then the new generation would come to power. And as we've seen in the Soviet Union, and as we saw in China, they'll just change their views and mindset, even in policies. But so far, that hasn't happened. So I don't see. And also, the current policy, as you know, is strategic patience, which is sort of waiting for them to change their behavior, and that hasn't appeared to have worked either. So I see a lot of criticism about current policies, but I don't see as an answer of where we go from here. And so people are kind of hoping that China will somehow crack down, with the new leadership in China, and we hear some little hints that this may occur, but it's not clear when or how effectively. So at the moment, we're all sort of grappling for ideas, and I have to admit, I can't think of a good solution either. I don't see any appetite for another Leap Day deal, although there is some press coverage that they're thinking of some kind of new engagement effort. But I just, I haven't seen anything concrete yet.
So I wanted to pass the China question then to Bruce. We heard some speculation this morning about changes in Chinese tactics or their assessment of the continued value of friendship with North Korea, and then also some hope, perhaps misplaced hope in Washington, that China will somehow come up with a new solution that delivers us from this 20-year-long problem. What's your sense about what's going on in Beijing?
Right now there's a debate in Washington about, has China gotten so fed up with North Korea and its behavior that they're finally going to change their policy, and they're going to impose more pressure on North Korea. It's a debate that will take some time to resolve, but I tend to be fairly skeptical, because a lot of the signals that people are pointing to, we've actually been seeing for years to no avail. Disagreement amongst Korea watchers, amongst Chinese government-sponsored think tanks, more Chinese experts on North Korea calling for more pressure, even abandoning North Korea as an ally. But we've been seeing that for years. And when an editor of a Chinese Communist Party journal wrote an article in Financial Times that was critical of North Korea, that was seen as a harbinger of change of Chinese policy until he was fired for it. And so I'm skeptical that we're going to see a change, because if we look back, in a way, really, China has either been on the sidelines of the issue, as Bong-Geun said, or I think really more part of the problem than part of the solution. At the UN, they've been obstructionists. They've prevented more comprehensive, more effective sanctions. They prevented any kind of action in response to North Korea's 2 acts of war in 2010. They prevented any meaningful acts after North Korea's revealing of the uranium enrichment facility, which is another violation of UN Security Council resolutions. They've turned a blind eye to North Korean proliferation. There was a WikiLeaks of a single State Department cable which showed that on 19 occasions the Bush administration had asked Beijing to intercede to prevent prohibited North Korean missile parts from transiting China to go to Iran, and China didn't take any action. And even the economic engagement with North Korea, which is perfectly legal, but by having more energetic engagement, it really undermines any incentive for North Korea to go back to the 6-party talks. The 6-party talks offers a number of benefits, diplomatic and economic, but it's conditional. It's conditional on North Korea fulfilling the pledges that it has made to denuclearize and abandon its nuclear arsenal. And if they can get the same benefits from economic engagement with China, outside of the 6-party talks, there's no reason to go back to the talks. I mean, if I tell my kids, I will give you dessert if you clean your room, and then my wife gives them chocolate cake, well, there's no reason for them to go, to do what they don't want to do. And I think just recently we've seen, I don't see any change in the new Chinese leadership's actions. China was just as obstructionist in the last UN Security Council resolution as before. A year ago, the U.S. and South Korea asked for 40 new North Korean entities be added to the sanctions list, and China prevented all but 3. We've seen China critical, but not identifying North Korea by name. And we see Beijing still having this sort of even-handed, value-neutral criticism, calling upon both Koreas to show restraint when there's only one belligerent Korea, and that's North Korea. So we can be hopeful, but I'm afraid I'm still skeptical.
So if we're debating in Washington how to interpret what's going on in Beijing, Bong-Geun, it seems like there's been a different debate, and maybe debate is too strong a word, but sort of an increase in discussion in South Korea, at least as seen from the outside, about what other options there might be, and in particular some nuclear options for South Korea. And maybe it's easy to read too much into that, but if we're starting to look at this question of dominoes in the region, South Korea is an obvious case, and Dr. Chung Bong-Geun has been quite vocal on this, even provocative, I guess I would say, on this issue. What's your sense about what the discourse is in South Korea on this issue? At what point might South Korea be better off with a nuclear option versus the current system of alignment?
Let me just raise this so-called Korea Trust process policy that the current Bong-Geun government is trying to pursue, and they are thinking of somewhat a long-term process, and they don't want to just cut corners. They just want to tackle the issues in a front way. and also they are ready to engage with North Korea. And it's not a sunshine policy, it's not a regime change policy, and it's not a constructive, policy. This is more of a proactive and in the engaging policies. And at the moment, North Korea, however, without North Korea's cooperation, you can't really, make a claim. So, however, it's my understanding that the South Korean government is trying to have some, icebreaker. So we are allowing this humanitarian assistance, and it's going to say that it's going to be different from, inter-Korean nuclear issues. So we very much hope that North Korea respond in a reciprocal ways, and also we will. Despite the North Korea's nuclear issues, there is a certain policy that we try to have dialogue with North Korea. And also in response to this North Korean nuclear threat, and we need a very strong military posture. So we are having only one end. Probably we may have three fronts in parallel. One is our military preparations, and we need to have a Korean-specific missile defense or kill chain system, and it's going to take lots of money and how long it's going to work, but we are working on it. And also on the sanctions, in order to make North Korea move, we need a very strong sanctions regime. And not only Korea, but the international society, but we need China should play a very important role there. And on the other hand, the third front is diplomacy. Still, we highly value this diplomacy should be working, and we're going to pursue to the full. And in the meantime, as this crisis continues domestically, we have a so-called nuclear option debate going on. In fact, we don't have much of debate. There are some people who are raising issue, and most other people are just sitting aside and don't make much. And the problem was that we are often hearing that in the newspaper that when you have a public poll, about 2/3 of Korean people are supportive. But my question was that we always take a poll when there is North Korean serious nuclear provocations. So probably Korean public, may feel like. But I asked those poor people that, why don't you say, having nuclear weapons is going to pay, we have to pay some prices for it. Then still, do you want to proceed with the nuclear armament? Then probably I think the Korean public will come up with a much different answer, I believe. And also still, the government has a very strong and firm policy that our denuclearization and non-proliferation is very much there. And also, we have very much high stake in our nuclear power generation. We need to be a player in global nuclear non-proliferation regime in order to run our peaceful use of nuclear energy programs, and also in order to export nuclear power plants, we have to be a very responsible non-proliferating state. I believe that a government has a firm policy. I think people are going to understand that.
Yeah, fair enough. Now, Richard, we had talked a little bit before in the break about the regional implications not being constrained to the region, that in fact there's this broader set of strategic interests between the U.S. and China and Russia that in some ways kind of conditions how we see the North Korea issue here. I wonder if you could maybe talk a little bit more about how you see those impacting on this issue.
Right. I think it's important we step back to look at this larger Russia-China U.S. dynamic. In one ways, we're cooperating more effectively than ever before on non-proliferation issues. We're all of the three countries are members of the or at least they're members of the key regimes or support the policies of the key non-proliferation regimes. Both China no longer openly sells nuclear weapons-related technologies to Pakistan, for example. Russia has adopted new export control regimes. The number of the sanctions and threats that the U.S. is putting on the two countries has become much narrower. They cooperate very effectively in renewing the NPT in the previous review conference. But on the other hand, the cooperation is still below what we desired. Bruce talked a lot about the problems between China and the case of Korea. We've got the same kind of problems happening with China and policies towards Iran. Russia and the U.S. work very well and closely on the case of Korea, but in the case of Iran, there are divergences. And these issues are swept up in broader disputes that countries are having on their strategic policies. And these are cross-cutting in ways that makes it hard to resolve differences in one area while leaving the other ones unchanged. So, for example, whereas the U.S., Russia, and China all agree on the importance of nonproliferation in principle, in practice they have diverging policy preferences like pursue in each case. Russia and China have expressed concern about U.S. missile defense programs. This primarily was a Russia focus for a while, but now the Chinese have become more openly concerned. At the recent summit between President Xi and Putin, they made some kind of declaration about they would cooperate more closely to deal with the threat of U.S. missile defenses. On the other hand, in the case of nuclear arms control, Russia and the United States find themselves sharing unease about the fact that as they continue to reduce their offensive strategic forces, China refuses to not only participate directly in this process, but is still non-transparent about a lot of issues that concern both countries. So Russians have said, though I think they're going to back away from this in the end, that they will refuse to negotiate further reductions in U.S. nuclear forces, in their strategic nuclear forces, just with the United States. It's got to be something that deals with the other nuclear powers. And that's often read particularly as China. And it's been the Russian scholars who have been, or at least Russian authors, who have been writing with most concern about what they think is an underestimation of the number of nuclear warheads that China possesses, alarm about the massive tunneling that we've seen taking place by the Chinese nuclear forces, uncertainty about whether China is going to be soon in a position where they can, as the phrase goes, race to parity and align themselves equally with China and the United States. Many people in the United States, particularly in Congress, will also share this concern, and that's going to be an impediment to further strategic nuclear reductions unless we somehow deal with the Chinese issue, if not directly by including them in strategic arms control talks, at least by getting more openness about how many such basic questions as how many nuclear warheads does China have, and what is it, since we don't know that issue and the Chinese refuse to disclose that, the way in which Russia and the United States have been much more open about their current forces. Other issues it's affecting in terms of strategic stability questions, it's clear that the Chinese view of strategic stability is different from the United States. And Russia, we used to put a lot of emphasis on the no first use question, and the Chinese would always stress that whenever you talked about them, about their nuclear policies. Well, don't worry, we have a no first use, and that's our arms control policy. But as Toby's colleague at Carnegie has been pointing out, James Acton, there's some evidence the Chinese are following the Russian path in the 1980s and backing away a bit from their no first use policy. And so we need a bit more clarification on that. In terms of tactical nuclear weapons, as you know, NATO and the United States have said that that they're very eager to deal with Russia's large number of tactical nuclear weapons, and that's something that's going to be a major requirement in Congress in order to see document another nuclear arms control agreement. But the Russians say, well, we'd like to cut them back, but we need them actually to defend our eastern frontier, and without saying so, that obviously is China. And so we're going to somehow have to deal with that. So you've got all these cross-cutting issues that are impeding progress in many areas we'd like to see in the relationship between these three countries. And there's not an easy way you can take out pieces of them as we've done in the past and deal with them separately. On the other hand, trying to deal with all together is going to be incredibly complex and challenging.
So I'd like to turn to the audience at this point. We've got about 20 minutes or so for questions. There's one right here. I think there's some microphones that are coming. There's one there as well. Do we have microphones? Yes. Yep. So if you could please just briefly identify yourself and ask your question.
Well, I'm Pan Xinqiang from China's Reform Forum. Since there is a mentioning of the role of China, and there is no member of the panel discussion, so I think that the good idea to provide very briefly China's perspective on the issues discussed about. I think that China's consistent view is the nuclear crisis of DPRK is not only the nuclear proliferation issue as per se. Now, if we look at the context of the peninsula or the nuclear issue of North Korea actually is the continuation of a confrontation between the United States and North Korea, and also between North and the South. And therefore, amidst a deep-seated mistrust among all these parties, I think that it's naive to expect that by asking China to pressurize North Korea and the issue could be solved. I think that's a too simple kind of wishful thinking. So China's position is the challenge to the issue today is not the change of China's position, but the awareness of these major contending parties. I mean, the United States, North Korea, and South Korea should be aware that a confrontational approach would be a dead end. And there must be a kind of a dialogue among these parties, together with other parties, like all the members of the six-party talks, to talk in the spirit of equality and mutual respect, and see whether this will lead to some kind of trust building. And I think that without minimum trust building, it's almost hopeless to solve this nuclear issue. Now, I think that our colleague from Hudson Institute talked also about China's position on nuclear arms control and disarmament. I don't think this is really the right platform to talk about China's position. But I strongly advise that you should read some of China's official documents and get an accurate interpretation of China's position on nuclear disarmament and nuclear arms control. Finally, a question to all the members of the panel. Now, in order to institutionalize the resolution of the nuclear issue in Northeast Asia, there is recently a rising voice, and that is, would it be possible or feasible for the region to explore the setup of kind of a nuclear weapons-free zone in Northeast Asia, parallel to the multilateral efforts for the denuclearization of DPRK, which means, of course, the region free of nuclear weapons should include the peninsula as well as Japan, and which should also imply that nuclear weapon states would have the obligation not to use or threaten to use nuclear weapons in this region. I think that that kind of efforts would provide a more propitious environment in which that the nuclear issue explored in Northeast Asia. I'll be interested in hear your response to that question.
Before I put that to the panel, I just want to clarify that you don't, or you would not include China in that
Well,
zone.
China, of course you should include China. China is a nuclear weapon state. So if you understand the norm of nuclear weapons free zone, usually the nuclear weapons free zone would include non-nuclear weapon states together with the obligations of the nuclear weapon states.
Does anyone on the panel want to take up the viability of a nuclear weapon-free zone in Northeast Asia?
Sure. Well, I'll address a few of the issues. I guess, obviously, we disagree on many of the precepts of the issues of the North Korean nuclear problem. When you talk about the continuation of the confrontation of the U.S. and North Korea in the South and the North, and the deep mistrust that North Korea has of the United States, I think it's useful to point out history of the actions of both countries. I mean, which Korea invaded the other in 1950? Which Korea several times tried to assassinate the president of the other Korea? Which Korea blew up a civilian airliner in midair? Which Korea routinely insults and threatens the other Korea? The U.S. has, made time after time after time pledges of non-hostility. My colleague Victor Cha did a study and came up with, 20 pages of, when you list them, of all the reassurances the U.S. has given. The balance just gets so unbalanced when you look at North Korean actions and threats and attacks and those of South Korea and the U.S. So, the mistrust should be by South Korea and the U.S. Those are the two countries that have been attacked by North Korea, not the other way around. On dialogue is great, but it's very hard when when North Korea is the one that severs the communication links, when North Korea refuses to engage in dialogue. Just last week, refused dialogue on Kaesong, refused to meet with Lee Myung-bak, is not responding very well to Park Geun-hye's efforts at trust building and dialogue. Mutual respect, words matter. When North Korea is calling upon, let's rip out the throat of Lee Myung-bak, et cetera, et cetera, that's not a great way of building trust. So again, I would put the onus on North Korea's words and actions. On institutionalizing, Northeast Asia weapons-free zone, nuclear weapons-free zone, well, the U.S. doesn't have any nukes in South Korea. We pulled them out in one of the many efforts to get North Korea never to pursue a nuclear weapons program. South Korea doesn't have any nuclear weapons. Japan doesn't have any nuclear weapons. So really, the nuclear weapons-free zone would be putting the onus on North Korea, China, and Russia to abandon their nuclear weapons.
Anyone else want to pick that up, Bong-Geun?
Just briefly, that we often have a very high expectation of China to play a very constructive role. I'm just asking China to play just a normal, a responsible role as a big power. We don't expect China to intervene in North Korea and do something that we want them to do. But just like any other normal states who are responsible in non-proliferation, who are party to non-proliferation regime, ought to behave in a certain way. But we can see that China is not really up to that point yet. And also concerning this Northeast Asia nuclear weapons-free zone, we haven't talked much about it since it has been the issue has been raised by North Korea about 20 years ago. But nowadays there is a little bit of the debate on the issues whether how are we going to bring this concept of nuclear weapons free zone into region, and certainly Inter-Korea, two Koreas should be weapons-free zone and the member of it. But however, what about China? And this zone includes the eastern part of China to be part of weapon-free, so that other countries in the region feel comfortable to be part of this weapon-free zone. That kind of issues were raised, but I haven't seen really a serious dialogue yet. Yep. But it could be one of the ideas that we want to pursue in the future.
So let's take two more, Chris Nelson, and then there was a question over here.
Thanks so much, Toby. Chris Nelson, Nelson Report. It's fascinating to hear the discussion over here because what I've been hearing in D.C., for those of you who are here, it may be useful for the last week or so, and I've been reporting it. There's a consensus that the administration has decided, once President Park arrives, to complete discussions on the notion that South Korea will, for now, take the initiative in trying to develop the possibility of having civilized negotiations with the North, and that it will be along the lines that President Park has so bravely suggested. That is, it's not going to be about the nuclear weapons. It's not going to be about the big issues. It's going to be about the North-South issues and the personal issues. In a sense, to try to build, to see if it's possible to have some confidence-building measures, some steps to reestablish the ability to talk with these guys. Because right now, that's not happening, number one. Number two, the administration sincerely feels that having tried the Leap Day agreement a year ago, that the North Korean decision that it wasn't worth having that kind of step with the United States if they had to not test a missile. Is that the case forever? Or can we look and see how President Park does? And if she has some success, can we then start to refocus on something like a Leap Day deal, meaning a more narrowly, less strategically, ultimately strategically focused deal? So it's not about denuclearization, it's about putting some kind of moratorium or freeze on continued testing and all that. That's the kind of conversation that we're having in D.C. But it's really predicated on giving President Park a chance to see if there's a chance to keep talking to these guys, or whether under the new leader this really is a new deal, and the old game of threats and provocations and outrages will be eventually replaced by another charm offensive, and we're back to this terrible decision of do we buy this horse or this cow again, and see how it comes out. So that's what we're hearing in D.C. anyway, so I thought it might be useful for you to hear that. And if the panel has some thoughts on what they're hearing here or seeing here about President Park's initiative, does that seem realistic to you? Is it, are there any reasons to feel hope? I think we'd all like to hear that, so thank you.
So let's hold off on sort of the reframing, and there was a question over here. Let's add that, and then we'll go back to the panel. So, excuse me, if we could go right up here.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm Professor Emeritus at Busan National University. I'd like to raise a rather fundamental question to the three presenters. The people around the world have seen a series of provocative behavior and provocative words pronounced by North Korea very recently. And also, we have to look at 2010 incidents, such as the sinking of Cheonan corvettes and bombing of a peaceful fishery island. This fishery island has nothing to do with North Korea's foreign policy, was with nothing to do with North Korea's nuclear development program. However, North Korea bombed 180 shells over the fishery island, Yongpyeon. Considering these provocative behavior and remarks, recent remarks of Kim Jong-un. It seems to be that North Korea has no idea, no will whatsoever to tackle or to rearrange its nuclear development programs. Professor John, do you think you can bring about the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula by simply sticking carrot or sticks? In my opinion, it's totally impossible. What's your opinion? Thank you.
So it looks like we have a question that's, these two questions are similar, and that is, can you get to denuclearization via confidence building in other areas, or should we move off of denuclearization and say that that's not a reasonable objective, and therefore we need to come up with another way of framing this problem so that we might have more stability, at least, with the relationship with North Korea?
Let me please start very briefly. We don't have much time. As I said in earlier presentation, that earlier we had the mistake of seeing things somewhat light way. Now we are somewhat too pessimistic, and still it's the goal that thinking of Korean unification. We can't unify with nuclear armed North Korea. We don't want. We need to unify. So we need, this denuclearization is as important as our unification goal. So that makes that possible. So I hope that's why this current government was somewhat opening the gate so that we come up with more of other options on the table. So come up with more of a Northeast Asian approach again. Northeast Asian peace initiative could help to denuclearize North Korea. And also we are trying to strengthen our relations with China. And also, this is going to be another big opportunity for President Park to come to U.S. and to share our ideas of how to denuclearize and sustain peace on the Korean Peninsula. And that's going to be he's taking some a kind of slow steps, but necessary steps to move forward to achieve our goals. And North Korea was, I believe it was 2008 when Kim Jong-il had a stroke. Since then, all North Korea policy was more of a introspective. They didn't think of other, South Korea, United States, or China. They didn't mind because they have such a serious domestic crisis situation. They didn't mind. They just pursue on their schedule. They tested, missiles and the nuclears and whatever. So we need now this Kim Jong-un is in power for a year, and I think he's taking a little time to recover from all this crisis situation. So we hope that we just open his eyes and to see outside so that we could proceed with some dialogue.
Bruce, what's your sense on this?
Well, I think sort of addressing some of Chris's points, my sense of the U.S. either encouraging or being willing to have Park Geun-hye take the lead is almost more of a passive aspect in that there really is no appetite in the administration to pursue another Leap Day agreement. The administration came in with very high hopes in 2009 that by not being George Bush, by being willing to sincerely offer dialogue with North Korea, that would solve the problem. And North Korea very quickly showed they weren't going to act any differently toward President Obama than to President Bush. And then, that caused, I think, a very strong policy change by the administration. Eventually, they came back to the Leap Day agreement, and then when 2 weeks after that's inception, North Korea announced it was going to violate it, I think that really was sort of a twice burned, thrice shy. So I think the sense in Washington is more sort of, hey, if you want to try it, go ahead, because there's not an eagerness by the Obama administration to try it again, and also knowing that if they do another Leap Day agreement, they'll likely face a lot of criticism for buying the same horse again. So I think with President Park, she has this, I think, a very pragmatic, very principled trust-building, trust policy, and I think the U.S. is sort of like, look, we've tried it twice, just during the Obama administration. It didn't work out very well. you give it a try. Hopefully you will have success. Now, the obvious thing is, will North Korea talk to South Korea? I mean, it takes two to tango, and I think, unfortunately, President Park's going to be out on the dance floor by herself. And also, it requires North Korea to be willing to denuclearize, and that has not been made obvious. You know, on her policy, Chris, I think in your reports, I sense a misreading of her policy. I think you've depicted as wanting to set aside the nuclear issue and try everything else. I don't think that's the case. I think if you look at her policy, you know, there are three pillars. One is, and what was always mentioned first, is building a strong deterrent. And from that, the other two pillars can follow. The second pillar is trust building, and that is incremental baby steps. If North Korea, you know, acts in a non-belligerent sense, then things like humanitarian assistance and developmental assistance can flow. But it's always in the context of proper behavior and progress on denuclearization. In private discussions with senior members of her administration, even the humanitarian assistance is conditioned on the behavior. And so that, I don't think she's setting aside the nuclear issue. I think that is part of it. So second pillar is trust building. Third pillar is sort of eventual unification, which clearly would be very far down the road. But I think denuclearization is very much prevalent throughout her trust building policy. And in that way, I think it's not, the policy is not that different from Lee Myung-bak's, although it's got a better packaging, and I think her administration will be much more adept at public diplomacy than the previous administration.
So unfortunately, we're out of time. I think we could probably go on for quite a few more hours on this issue. I'm sure that discussions will continue in the hallway. Since I neglected to do that at the outset, please let me also add my thanks to the Asan Institute for inviting us to have a discussion, and thanks to Richard and Bruce and Bong-Geun for a good discussion here. So thanks very much.